A medieval woman could divorce her husband for one specific bedroom failure, and the proof required 3 witnesses in the actual room, watching. This wasn't scandalous, it was standard legal procedure. And honestly, that's not even the strangest rule on this list. Not even close. In 897 AD, Pope Formosus was dug up from his grave, dressed in full papal robes, and propped on a throne. Why? To stand trial. Well, sit trial. The man had been dead for 9 months. This wasn't some mob doing weird revenge stuff. This was an official church court, with judges, witnesses, even a defense lawyer appointed to speak for the rotting corpse. The charges? Basically being pope illegally. And guess what? He lost. They stripped his papal vestments right there, hacked off the 3 fingers he'd used for blessings, and tossed his body into the Tiber River. But here's the thing. Corpse trials weren't rare. Courts across medieval Europe prosecuted dead bodies for crimes committed while alive. The logic was actually theological. Punishment affected the soul's reputation and protected the community's moral order. Suicide victims got it worst. Their bodies were dragged through streets and buried at crossroads with stakes through them, to prevent haunting. Now, humans on trial makes sense. But animals? In 1386, a pig in Falaise, France, stood trial for murder. Not a metaphorical trial, a real one, with a judge, witnesses, and a defense attorney representing the pig. The crime? Killing a child? Here's where it gets stranger. Before execution, authorities dressed the pig in human clothes, a jacket, gloves on its hooves. Then they hanged it in the town square, the exact method used for human murderers. And this wasn't some one-time medieval madness. Court records document over 200 animal trials across Europe. Pigs, bulls, horses. Even insects faced justice. Rats were formally summoned to court. Weevils destroying crops got their own lawyers. The defense arguments were genuinely creative. One attorney got his animal client acquitted by arguing that pigs lack moral understanding. They can't comprehend right from wrong, so how can they be guilty? Fair point, honestly. These trials sometimes dragged on for weeks, with appeals, expert testimony, the whole legal circus. But animals weren't the only unexpected targets of medieval law. Your wardrobe could land you in serious trouble too. Sumptuary laws told you exactly what you could wear, and they weren't suggestions. Purple? Royalty only. Scarlet red? Nobility. Caught wearing the wrong shade as a merchant in 14th century England, and you'd lose the clothes right off your back, plus a fine that'd hurt. Here's the thing. Officials called sumptuary inspectors actually patrolled the streets. Their whole job was checking what people wore, like medieval fashion police, except with real power. Florence went absolutely mad with enforcement. Over 1,000 clothing violations recorded in a single year during the 1340s. 1,000 for wearing the wrong colors. Why did authorities care so much about fabric? Simple. They couldn't tell who was who. A peasant dressed like a lord meant social chaos. At least, that's what they believed. Some dyes cost more than houses, literally. So wearing them without the right bloodline was basically flaunting stolen wealth. But clothing restrictions were just the start. Even grinding your own grain could get you arrested. Lords didn't just own the land, they owned the mills too. Every peasant needed grain ground into flour. And the only legal option? Pay the lord's mill. His prices, his rules, owning a hand-grinding stone at home? Illegal. Getting caught with one hidden under your bed meant losing your entire harvest as a fine. Gone. Just like that. Here's where it gets absurd. Soldiers actually raided cottages looking for these stones, called querns. Imagine armed men kicking down doors over a rock, but these rocks threatened profits. Some families got desperate. They'd grind grain at night, throwing blankets over the stones to muffle the noise. Medieval bootlegging, except with flour. Abbey records reveal something fascinating. Certain lords earned more from milling fees than any other source, more than rent, more than taxes on livestock, just forcing people to use their equipment. This monopoly sparked actual revolts across England and France. Peasants died fighting over the right to crush their own wheat. But speaking of things that could get you punished, church wasn't optional, and neither was sitting still. Laughing during Mass? That could land you in the stocks, not metaphorically, literally sitting in a wooden frame while your neighbors pelted your face with garbage. The crime was called disrupting divine service. Coughing too loud counted. Falling asleep? Absolutely. Some parishes kept written records of every offender. Medieval permanent records, basically. Here's where it gets ridiculous. Churches actually installed waking sticks, long poles so wardens could poke sleepy parishioners from across the room, getting jabbed awake by a stranger with a stick during a sermon. That was normal. Repeat offenders faced excommunication. Sounds spiritual, right? Wrong. It meant nobody could legally trade with you. No buying bread, no selling crops, economic death. Church wardens watched everyone like hall monitors with actual power. One yawn at the wrong moment, and your reputation was ruined. Permanently. Makes our modern phones off during service signs seem pretty reasonable. Speaking of punishments for minor offenses, here's the thing about medieval justice. It wasn't really about what you did. It was about who you were. And if you were a woman who talked too much, they had a special torture device waiting. The ducking stool, a wooden chair attached to a long beam positioned over the nearest river or pond. Your crime? Scolding, which basically meant disagreeing with your husband, or complaining too loudly, or honestly, just being annoying. Men got to decide what counted as excessive nagging. Convenient, right? The punishment was simple. Strap her in, dunk her under, bring her back up, repeat until she learned to keep quiet. Winter made it worse. Court records from 1375 describe breaking ice specifically to make the water colder. 3 dunks for sharp words. That was the sentence. These stools weren't hidden away somewhere. They sat in village centers as permanent warnings. Every outspoken woman walked past her potential fate daily. The practice survived until the 1800s, but speaking of controlling what people could own, now here's where medieval law gets genuinely strange. Beekeepers had to formally notify their bees when someone died, not as a sweet tradition, as actual legal requirement. Some regions demanded witnesses present to confirm the bees received the news properly, official witnesses, for talking to insects. The ritual involved knocking 3 times on each hive, then speaking the sad news aloud. Your master has died. Every single hive, every single time. Skip this step, the bees would supposedly abandon the hive or die themselves, and that mattered legally because bees produced wax for church candles. These fuzzy little insects powered medieval Christianity's lighting bill. Mourning cloths were draped over hives. Bees received formal invitations to funeral feasts. Some wills specifically named a bee teller responsible for breaking the news. I've forgotten to water plants for a week. These people were drafting legal documents about insect grief counseling. The strangest part? This belief persisted for centuries. But speaking of strange obligations that came with running a business, so you've survived the road, found an inn, collapsed into bed after a long journey. Morning comes. Your coin purse is gone. Here's the twist. That's now the innkeeper's problem, not yours. Medieval hospitality law held innkeepers personally liable for anything stolen under their roof. Full reimbursement, no wiggle room, no, sorry, check the lost and found. This rule traced back to Roman times, but medieval courts enforced it brutally. Your money vanishes, the innkeeper pays it back from his own pocket. You can imagine how paranoid this made them. Some demanded valuable items as collateral before you even got a room key. Others hired night watchmen to patrol hallways like prison guards, anything to avoid covering someone else's stolen jewelry. And if an innkeeper got caught working with robbers, execution. Sacred hospitality duties meant the crime was basically treason against travelers everywhere. I can barely get hotels to replace missing towels. These people were running medieval insurance companies. But innkeepers weren't the only business owners with bizarre legal headaches. You find a dead whale on the beach. Free money, right? Wrong. That tongue belongs to the king. Royal fish laws made every beached whale and sturgeon automatic crown property. The king got the tongue, the queen got the tail, specifically for her wardrobe budget. Don't ask me how whale tail translates to dresses. And if you started carving up that whale before royal officials arrived, theft from the monarch. In 1315, one man got thrown in prison for exactly that crime. The reasoning made sense. Whale oil lit royal palaces. Whale bones became corset stays. A single beaching was worth a small fortune. Here's the wild part. This law still technically exists in Britain today. If a whale washes up on English shores, it legally belongs to the sitting monarch. Though I'm guessing King Charles isn't personally collecting whale tongues. These creatures belong to royalty even in death. But when it came to settling disputes between living people, medieval law got even stranger. Owed someone money in medieval times, you could literally fight about it. Trial by combat wasn't reserved for knights defending honor. Regular folks dragged each other into arenas over unpaid debts, disputed property, even borrowed farm equipment. Here's how it worked. Both parties showed up, grabbed weapons, and beat each other senseless until someone surrendered, died, or couldn't stand anymore. The loser was automatically guilty. No appeals, no second opinions. Too old to fight, too weak, no problem. You could hire a professional champion to bleed for you. These guys made decent livings getting stabbed over other people's financial disagreements. And get this, the last official request for trial by combat in England came in 1818. Not 1418, 1818. The accused murderer demanded it, and courts realized they'd never actually abolished it. Awkward. The law eventually required proof you'd tried talking it out first. Medieval conflict resolution, everybody. But settling disputes was one thing. Protecting royal property, that's where laws turned genuinely deadly. Royal forests weren't parks. They were the king's private hunting grounds, and touching them could cost your life. Chopping down an oak tree? That was a hanging offense. Why oaks specifically? Because deer hid under them. Kill the tree, ruin the king's hunt, lose your head. Simple math. Here's what really made this brutal. Forest law operated under completely different courts than normal English law. Different judges, different rules, way harsher punishments. At its peak, 1/3 of England was classified as royal forest. 1/3. Most people lived within walking distance of trees they couldn't legally touch. Even picking up fallen branches required official permission from forest wardens. Dead wood, stuff already on the ground. You needed paperwork for twigs. And dogs? If your dog lived near a royal forest, authorities cut off 3 of its toes. Couldn't have pets chasing the king's deer, apparently. The penalties were insane, but the people who cleaned up after everyone else, their rules were somehow even stranger. Ever wonder who dealt with all the, waste? Meet the gong farmers. Medieval cities produced mountains of human excrement, and someone had to shovel it. But here's the catch. They could only work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. Strict curfew, no exceptions. Why? Because polite society couldn't handle seeing or smelling what these guys carried through the streets. The job paid 6 times a normal laborer's wage. Sounds great until you learn people actually drowned in cesspits. That was a real occupational hazard, falling into literal human waste and dying. And the work didn't end at sunrise. Every drop had to be hauled outside city limits before dawn, or you faced fines. London even required licenses. This wasn't some unregulated gig. It was an official profession with paperwork. 1326 law threatened imprisonment for any gong farmer caught working in daylight. The people handling your filth had stricter rules than doctors. Speaking of which, doctors had some bizarre restrictions of their own. Here's the thing about medieval doctors. They couldn't actually touch you, not surgically anyway. The Catholic Church had this rule. The Church abhors the shedding of blood. Since most physicians trained in church-run universities, they were forbidden from cutting into anyone. Period. So who handled the actual cutting? Barbers. The same guy trimming your beard might amputate your leg an hour later. No medical school. Minimal training. Just steady hands and sharp razors. That red and white barber pole outside old shops, those stripes represent bloody bandages wrapped around a pole to dry between patients. Cheerful, right? Barber surgeons pulled teeth, drained wounds, and performed bloodletting. Eventually, so many patients died that guilds started requiring basic examinations. Progress, I suppose. This ridiculous split between thinking doctors and cutting barbers lasted until the 1800s. Nearly 5 centuries of physicians standing around diagnosing while untrained barbers did the dangerous work. Speaking of dangerous work, selling bad meat could literally blow up in your face. Selling rotten meat in medieval times wasn't just bad for business. It was bad for your nostrils. Here's how punishment worked. Inspectors found your spoiled fish. They'd burn it right under your nose. Literally. You stood there inhaling the smoke of your own terrible product. And if you did it again, They'd hang the rotten meat around your neck like the world's worst necklace, then lock you in the pillory for everyone to see. And smell. Market inspectors showed up at dawn every single day. Their official quality test? The gag reflex. If they nearly vomited, you were in trouble. York's records mention butchers fined for selling measled pork. That's meat with visible parasites crawling through it. Appetizing. Some cities got clever. They forced butchers to work in open-air stalls. No walls, no hiding spots, nothing between your product and dozens of watchful eyes. But speaking of being forced to do things, blacksmiths had their own mandatory obligations. Horses weren't just transportation, they were military equipment with legs. And because kingdoms needed cavalry ready at all times, blacksmiths couldn't just turn customers away. It was illegal. Imagine running a business where you're legally required to serve anyone who walks in. No "we're closed" signs, no "come back tomorrow." A farmer shows up at dinner time? Too bad. Shoe his horse. Refusing meant fines. Repeat refusals, you'd lose your license entirely. Your forge goes cold. Your livelihood gone. But here's the trade-off. Smiths got tax breaks and guaranteed income. Army commanders could literally walk into any forge during wartime and demand service. No negotiation. No payment discussions up front. Some villages actually required blacksmiths to keep their forges burning during set hours, like a medieval emergency room, but for hooves. So yeah, essential workers facing government mandates. Some things never change. Now, speaking of people getting treated differently based on where they came from, traveling to the next town over, better bring extra coins. Stranger merchants faced fees that locals never paid. And by stranger, I don't mean someone from another country, someone from 20 miles away. Foreigner. Pay up. Cities slapped double or triple taxes on outside traders at every market stall. The goal was simple: protect local craftsmen from competition. Why let cheaper goods in when you can just price them out? Here's how petty it got. London charged merchants from York double rates. York was 200 miles away. Same kingdom, same language, different prices. Some towns charged you just to walk through the gates while carrying goods, not selling them, carrying them. Merchant guilds spent fortunes negotiating exemptions across different cities. It was basically medieval paperwork warfare, and the fees didn't stop at markets. Need lodging, tourist prices, want food, extra charge. But location didn't just affect your wallet, it could actually determine your entire life, right down to your address. Your job didn't just decide your income, it decided your address. Tanners, butchers, dyers, they couldn't live wherever they wanted. The law literally pushed them downstream, downwind, away from respectable people. And honestly, fair enough. Tanning leather required soaking hides in a lovely mixture of urine and animal feces. For weeks, the smell could make your eyes water from 3 streets away. So medieval city planners created what we'd now call industrial zones. All the stinking trades clustered together in one unfortunate corner of town. But here's where it gets serious. If a tanner moved his workshop upwind without permission, authorities could demolish it. Not fine him. Demolish it. These neighborhoods carried permanent social stigma too. Living on Tanner's Row told everyone exactly where you stood in society. Your address was basically a name tag announcing your place in the pecking order. But location rules were nothing compared to what the church controlled. Even your dinner plate wasn't safe. Fish rules in medieval times? Absolutely bonkers. The church demanded you eat fish on Wednesdays, Fridays, and during Lent. That's nearly half the year with no meat allowed. But here's the twist. Catching those fish on Sundays. Illegal, because working on the Sabbath was a sin. So let me get this straight. You needed fish to obey religious law, but catching fish broke religious law. Medieval logic at its finest. Fishmongers made fortunes stockpiling catches before Fridays when demand exploded. Though stockpiling fish and freshness aren't exactly best friends. Royal fish ponds were completely off limits, every day, year-round. Those fish belonged to the king, and touching them meant serious trouble. One poor guy got thrown in jail in 1287 for setting nets on Easter Sunday. The irony? Everyone desperately needed fish for Easter dinner. But complicated food rules were nothing compared to what happened when your parents died, especially if you were a child. When a serf died, their kids didn't go to relatives. They became property. The manor lord automatically owned every orphan whose parents worked his land. full custody, zero questions asked. And here's where it gets truly ugly. Lords could sell these children's future marriages to whoever paid the most. Every penny went straight into the lord's pocket. Refuse to marry the stranger your lord picked? Fine. But you'd owe him the full financial value of that marriage as compensation. Most orphans couldn't afford that, so they had no choice. These weren't adoption arrangements. They were business transactions. Records actually show lords auctioning off wealthy orphans like livestock at market day. Church courts occasionally stepped in if a proposed match was obviously abusive, but occasionally did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The system treated children as accessories to land, assets, inventory. But speaking of people being controlled by powerful institutions, wait until you hear what orphans had to do with dice. Gambling, the ultimate medieval addiction. Kings got so tired of soldiers blowing their wages on dice that they made it illegal, not just frowned upon. Actually, against the law. Richard I required his crusading soldiers to get written permission before touching a single die. Common soldiers caught gambling without a license? Flogged. Officers and knights? They could roll whenever they wanted, because apparently addiction only counts if you're poor. Here's the wildest part. There was literally a gambling season. Christmas. That's when ordinary people could legally play dice. The rest of the year? Better hide those cubes. Licensed gambling houses existed, but they paid massive fees to the crown. The king basically ran a protection racket on vice, and cheaters branded, hot iron to the skin. Because weighted dice wasn't just cheating your buddy, it was theft and deception combined. Some hustlers filled dice with mercury to rig the rolls. Inspectors got so good they could spot fakes just by watching them tumble. But if you think gambling rules were strict, wait until you hear what happened if you spoke the wrong language in court. After conquering Wales, Edward I didn't just take the land, he took the language. Speaking Welsh in any English court became grounds for automatic case dismissal. Not a fine, not a warning. Your entire lawsuit, gone. Thrown out because you said it wrong. Welsh names couldn't even appear on legal documents. Gwilym became William. Dafydd became David. Your identity, rewritten by a clerk who probably couldn't pronounce your real name anyway. And clerks were explicitly forbidden from recording Welsh testimony. So if you only spoke Welsh, good luck proving anything. The cruelty was deliberate, forced people to abandon their language, and eventually they abandoned their identity. Classic conquest playbook. Even Welsh nobles had to conduct business in English. Some barely understood the words coming out of their own mouths during property disputes. Poor Welsh speakers, they hired translators, extra cost, extra barriers, extra ways to keep them out of their own justice system. But language barriers were nothing compared to the next rule. Because if you faked an injury to beg, faking a limp for spare change, that could get you killed. Medieval authorities despised able-bodied beggars pretending to be disabled. So they created inspectors whose entire job was examining beggars' bodies for fake injuries. The punishments were horrific: branding, ear cropping, and for repeat offenders, execution. Some fakers got creative. Abraham men pretended to be insane, ranting and drooling in the streets. They were so convincing that authorities developed actual medical examinations to catch them. Here's how serious this got. The 1349 Statute of Laborers made refusing work a crime. If you could work but chose to beg instead, straight to jail. Licensed beggars existed, though. They wore official badges proving their disability was genuine. No badge, instant arrest. The dark irony? Some fake beggars earned more than skilled craftsmen. The risk of execution was literally worth the reward. But speaking of getting away with serious crimes, there was one loophole that let actual murderers walk free. All they had to do was read. Reading saved lives, literally. Benefit of clergy was a legal loophole so absurd it sounds made up. If you could read one specific Bible verse, Psalm 51, you walked free. Murder, theft, assault, didn't matter. Originally, this protected priests from civil courts, but here's where it gets ridiculous. The rule expanded to anyone who could read. So suddenly, literacy became a get-out-of-execution-free card. Courts used the same psalm every single time, for decades. You see where this is going, right? Prisoners memorized it. Couldn't read a word, but they'd recite that verse perfectly. Guards probably rolled their eyes watching another literate murderer walk out. The one catch? You could only use this trick once, so authorities branded your thumb afterward, kind of like a medieval punch card except for escaping death. This loophole stayed open until the 1800s, centuries after anyone thought it made sense. But speaking of things the crown controlled, even discussing the king's health could get you killed. Kings don't get sick. Ever. At least, that's what you had to pretend. Saying the king looks unwell wasn't gossip. It was treason. The charge? Imagining the king's death. Even if you were just commenting on a bad cough. The logic was paranoid, but simple. Any hint of royal weakness invited enemies. Foreign powers, ambitious nobles, that cousin who'd been eyeing the throne a little too hard. So everyone at court developed this ridiculous coded language. Instead of, His Majesty has a fever, you'd say something like, the weather in the palace seems heavy. Real subtle, guys. One London merchant learned this the hard way in 1450. His crime? Telling someone the king looked unwell. That's it. Arrested. Just for having eyes and using them. This made discussing succession basically illegal while the monarch still breathed. Planning for the future was plotting against the present. And speaking of marking people for who they were, medieval Jews faced something far more visible. In 1215, the Catholic Church decided Jewish people needed to be visually marked, everywhere, all the time. The Fourth Lateran Council mandated distinctive badges across Europe. In England, a yellow felt patch shaped like the tablets of Moses, sewn right on your chest where everyone could see it. The official reason was preventing accidental mixing. Christians might unknowingly do business with Jews, or worse, marry one. The badge solved that problem. Size requirements were oddly specific, 2 fingers wide, 4 fingers long. Placement rules varied by region, but visibility was always mandatory. Remove it in public, that's a fine. Maybe property confiscation. The badge wasn't optional identification. It was compulsory humiliation dressed up as administrative policy. And here's the part that makes your stomach turn. This medieval practice didn't die in the medieval period. Nazi Germany looked directly at these laws when designing their own yellow badges 7 centuries later. Some ideas don't deserve resurrection, but speaking of being marked by your profession, winning too many lawsuits had its own consequences. So you're the type who likes justice. You sue when wronged, you win, then you sue again. Win again. In medieval courts, that made you suspicious. Repeat plaintiffs weren't seen as victims with bad luck. They were labeled common barrators, professional troublemakers gaming the legal system. And here's where it gets genuinely unfair. Once that label stuck, courts dismissed your future cases without even hearing them. Didn't matter if your claim was legitimate. You'd already been flagged as a problem. The logic was almost insulting. Honest people settle disputes privately. Only schemers run to court repeatedly. Every additional lawsuit after receiving a barratry warning meant fines. Stack up enough cases, and communities could exile you entirely. Some medieval lawyers actually made careers ruining neighbors through endless litigation. So the rule wasn't entirely paranoid, but imagine being genuinely wrong 3 times by 3 different people. Congratulations, you're now legally classified as the villain. Speaking of women getting unfair treatment, midwives faced accusations before they even delivered their first baby. Midwives delivered babies. That's it. But medieval authorities looked at them and thought, possible witch. Before a midwife could legally practice, she had to swear an oath. Not just promising competence, she had to specifically vow she wouldn't use magic during deliveries. The oath got weirdly specific. No secretly baptizing stillborn babies to sell their souls. No summoning demons when things got complicated. No sneaking body parts for potions. Here's what's genuinely dark. Lose too many babies? Investigation time. Authorities assumed deliberate harm before considering that childbirth in an era without antibiotics was just dangerous. Unlicensed midwives had it worse. No oath on file meant automatic witchcraft suspicion if anything went wrong. The strangest requirement? Reporting monstrous births, any baby with deformities, as potential signs of demonic activity. Despite all this paranoia, licensed midwives earned solid income and real community respect. They just had to prove they weren't Satan's employee first. Speaking of proving yourself, Building the wrong house could get it torn down. So you've got money. You want a nice house. 3 stories, extra chimneys, big windows, not so fast. Medieval cities had actual laws dictating how tall your house could be based on your social rank. A wool merchant in 14th century London who got ambitious with a 3rd floor, officials could force him to tear it down at his own expense. The rules got absurdly specific. Only nobility could have more than 2 heated rooms. Stone facades, noble privilege. Guild masters could use stone foundations but had to stick with wooden walls above ground. Cities appointed inspectors called viewers to audit new construction. Their entire job was measuring houses and counting chimneys. Here's where it gets funny. Wealthy merchants eventually just paid the fines and kept their big houses anyway. The rules backfired completely. Why demolish a profitable building when you can treat penalties as a luxury tax? But at least bad houses just got torn down. Bad bread? That punishment involved public humiliation. Bread wasn't just food. It was survival, and medieval authorities knew it. The assize of bread from 1266 controlled exactly how much a loaf should weigh based on current grain prices. Cheat a customer? That's not a fine, that's a public spectacle. Dishonest bakers got strapped to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the streets while crowds pelted them with rotten vegetables. Sometimes their own stale bread. The humiliation was the point. Here's where it gets practical. Bakers started adding an extra roll to every order of 12. 13 for the price of 12. Not generosity, insurance. That's where baker's dozen comes from, and inspectors weren't messing around. They carried scales through London markets daily, weighing loaves at random. Some clever bakers hollowed out the centers of bread to fake the size. Inspectors learned to squeeze loaves, feeling for air pockets. Get caught 3 times? Your oven gets destroyed. Career over. But bread problems seem tame compared to singing the wrong song. Sing the wrong song in medieval Europe? That's not embarrassment. That's a criminal offense. Wandering minstrels without a noble patron were legally classified as vagabonds. Same category as beggars and thieves. The 1383 Statute of Cambridge specifically named minstrels wandering about as a public nuisance. Want to perform legally? You needed a lord's official patronage, his livery stitched to your coat, basically a work ID badge, medieval style. But here's where it gets brutal. Sing something politically critical, mock the wrong person, authorities might bore a hole through your tongue. The logic? Your tongue committed the crime, so your tongue gets punished. And don't think churches were more relaxed. Singing obscene songs near cemeteries was specifically banned. Why so specific? Because people actually did it at funerals, repeatedly. So next time you belt out karaoke after a few drinks, appreciate that nobody's checking your singing license. 30 rules, all real. The past was absolutely wild.